I'm Angela Aranha, nee Barreto. My parents were Jose da Gama Barreto and Greta Neri, Dr. Greta Neri. My father was born in Goa and educated there for his primary education in Portuguese. And he was taken by an uncle to Chennai, where he completed his studies in St. Bede's School. And I think after his matriculation, he joined the telegraph department of India. And my mother was a doctor. In those days, it was quite a wonderful thing for her to leave home. And she went to Lady Hardinge Medical College in Delhi. And I think it was affiliated to the University of Lahore. And she completed her studies, her MBBS, and went to work in Simla.
In the Himalayan foothills?
Yes.
Well, in the Himalayas, I guess.
Right. Anyway, I was not born then.
What was she doing in Simla?
She was a doctor, and probably her first job, it was, I think, an American mission hospital, but I'm not quite sure about that. And that's where she met my father. My father was already married, and he had a wife who was quite sickly, from what I hear. And she had a little baby of 1.5, and my mother was very friendly with his family because the mother was ill. And she used to visit them, and they got to know her very well, and she was very fond of this little baby. And when the baby was 1.5, the mother died. That person, she was an Anglo-Indian. Her name was Iris Scott. And she died, I believe, of tuberculosis. And they were left, my father was left with this family and this little baby. The other children were all growing up.
There were 4 other children already,
Yes, 4
apart from the
other
baby.
children. So the baby was Anne, and she's also alive. She's in England now. And my mother had made up her mind that she's not going to get married. She was about 28 years old at that time. And the priests in Simla, in India it's the custom to arrange a marriage. Now she was she'd made up her mind she wants to work and give her life to being a doctor and not get married. But the priests arranged this match, seeing that my father was left with this little child. So they were married, and 4 years after their marriage, I was born. So, yeah.
When were you born? And how old were you at the time that we're talking about in this program?
Born in
Say it again.
Okay. Where do I start? I was born in 1943, and at the time of my father's tragic death in Baramulla, I was just 4 years old. In fact, I just had my birthday, just a little before that, and there was a party and all that I remember too. Yes.
Tell me where you lived in those days and about your memories of Baramulla.
Yes. Before we went to Baramulla, we were living in Rawalpindi, which was then, that is Pakistan, before the partition. And my father was about to retire from the telegraph department of India, and we were planning to come back to India proper, where my mother would pursue further studies, medical studies. My mother was offered this job to stand in locum for a nun doctor who was going back to Europe for a holiday. And we were offered a cottage there, and we thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to see Kashmir before we come back to India. So,
This was just a short-term temporary job, is that right?
Yes. It probably was a duration of about 6 months. I forget exactly when we went up to Baramulla, but I have a letter of my father's, which I should have,
You could bring it.
I should have got it out, but I don't know exactly where it is at present. Yes, I can locate it.
Maybe later.
Yes. So,
You went to. Can you?
yes.
What can you remember about? Yeah,
I
going to
remember-
Baramulla.
Yes, before we went to Baramulla, we went to Srinagar, and we had a lovely holiday. I remember that on the Dal Lake in a houseboat, and I was really intrigued with these houseboats. And I remember an incident where in the night they said that the houseboat, the little boat, which was our kitchen, sank, I believe. And I remember that. But I remember that I was intrigued with these houseboats, and they had these little toy houseboats which my sister bought for me. And when she would visit us later on in Baramulla, she would bring me these little houseboats. I remember all that. And then probably shortly after this, we left and we went up to Baramulla. So,
What can you remember about Baramulla?
well, I just have wonderful memories before this tragedy took place of a beautiful place with the mountains in the backdrop, huge trees, and being able to run wild and free. And while my parents were busy, my father had to look after me while my mother worked. And I would run wild with the Kashmiri children in the tall grass, much to the annoyance of my father, who always had to track me down. And I would throw away my shoes and he would have to look for them. And I would get a good scolding when I came back. I still remember having to kneel down and a lot of punishments because he was a very strict man, but very kind, very loving. And my memories are very pleasant. It was just a beautiful place. I was spoilt by everyone around, being the little daughter of their lady doctor. My father and I would visit the hospital every day. We were staying on the premises in a little cottage, and we would go sometimes while she was doing her rounds, and the nurses would come out and spoil me, and they always had these little boxes of biscuits, and they would take them out of the cupboard and they would give me, and I would beg for these crusts of bread which were black, and my mother would say, "Don't you dare give that to my daughter to eat." And it comes later on into the story that we had to, this was our only food, our only form of food for 11 days that we were holed up in that ward, 90 people. So she always remembered how she forbade those nurses to give me that food, and that was the only food left in the cupboards. The little Kashmiri children were given those little biscuits when they were admitted into the hospital. So I remember that, yeah.
Did you ever go into the convent? Can you remember the convent itself?
I can't really remember the convent itself, but I remember the nuns and more the nurses, I think. But probably some of the nuns were nurses. And
Was it a friendly community? Sounds like it was.
yes. Yes, I think it was a very friendly community, very close-knit. And my mother was very happy there. And my father too, with nothing to do over there except look after me. I think the nuns were very good to us, very kind. And we had the Mill Hill Fathers, I think, had a mission there. And it was all in one compound. And there was a Reverend Father Shanks, and a Father Mallet, whom I remember, whom my mother visited some years later in England. And every evening, I would go to the convent, to the chapel. I don't think it was the interior of the convent, but it was the chapel. And they had benediction. And I still have it in my letter from my father that Angela loves benediction because of that lovely incense, and it was such a holy and solemn ceremony. And I used to say, I'm joining the nuns, and I want to be like my sister, who was in the novitiate in the same order in Sri Lanka. At that time it was Ceylon. She was in Colombo, Ceylon, and awaiting her final vows and the day that she would get her habit and become a nun.
So she was already a novitiate at that time, because she was a lot older.
Over, yes. Yeah.
Your dad had retired, you said, from the telegraph service. So was he? He wasn't working. He was looking after you, I guess. So you were seeing a lot of your dad. Can you tell me a little bit more about your memories of him?
Yes, he was a very wonderful person, full of fun and humor and wit. And I think I had a lot of fun with him, although he was very strict with me. And if he had to, for running away, if he had to punish me, he'd make me kneel down. And I still remember he'd say, bang your head on the wall. So I think in those days he had a little bit of his, probably had a Victorian upbringing or something. He was very strict with my sisters. I remember them even mentioning that he would sometimes belt them if they did anything that displeased him. He was a very tidy person, clean, neat. You couldn't touch his cupboard, he would know. He was that sort of person. Yeah. But he was full of humor. My parents always kept an open house, friends, and those are the sort of memories I have with them. Yeah.
Who else do you remember from the convent and hospital? You have mentioned quite a few people. Anyone else you'd like to mention? But I'm wondering particularly about the Dykes family. Now, they maybe just came to the hospital when she was going to have the baby. Did you know them already from around the town?
Well, being a little girl, my memories of them, I don't remember them as a family. But my mother did tell me about them, about the terrible tragedy that took place that day. And later on, I've come to read and know more about them. I heard... Yes, I'm sorry. My mother told me that they were murdered, slaughtered, and thrown into a well. And that is what I heard. And I didn't know that until later that they were surviving. I heard that I didn't know who there was in that family. I didn't know how many children there were. But if they were living close to the hospital and around the hospital and the mother was admitted there, I would definitely have known them and the children and maybe played with them too.
You can't actually remember playing with children?
No. But I did have a birthday party, and I don't know who they would have. I was born on the 14th of October, 2 weeks before my father was shot. So they mentioned that I was to have a party, so I probably, if they were there, and the mother was admitted into hospital, I think she was there for about 10 days.
Just remind me there were 2 boys, I think, before the baby was born.
Yes, there were 2 boys. And I seem to remember this name Douglas. Now I don't know if anyone has told me about it. That's probably the younger boy. But that name always came back to me when I thought of the Dykes people. But I cannot be absolutely certain about it.
I assume they were living there in Baramulla. He was stationed there as a military man.
Yes, but I believe the father wasn't there at that time. Not quite sure. But the mother was there, admitted to have her baby. And I don't know how I think he was Colonel Dykes. I'm not quite sure. But I don't know when he came, but he must have come that tragic day. He must have come there. And how long they were there in the hospital, I wouldn't know.
Can you take me through what you remember of that terrible day? Yes. In detail, if you can.
Okay. You want my memories? Well, I remember that morning that... Now you must understand that I was a very little girl, and probably a lot of it has been told to me. So I will try to remember it as best as I can. But I remember it was just quite a normal day, and my father was trying to get me to eat my breakfast, and my mother was all in a hurry to get to the hospital for her rounds. It was probably around 8 in the morning, and she left. And I remember later my father... Wait, I think I have to go back a little. I'm slightly confused. See, yes, because I'll just say something about that it was a very normal day. My mother was getting ready to go to work, and we were having our breakfast, and after when she was about to leave, I would say, there were some shots being heard in the somewhere around the town or in the hills around. And my father said, "Don't worry, that's nothing, that's just Raja's men, they're having their routine target practice."
Like the Maharaja?
Yes, my mother was a little worried. And anyway, she left the house and she went for her rounds. Then probably it was our normal routine to go to the hospital a little later after her. I don't know what my father did, but probably went for a walk with me. And so we were going to the hospital, and everything was going on as normal. But there were more shots being heard in the background. And we were not quite sure what this was, when all of a sudden, a lot of noise and screaming and shouting. And these men came from all directions, climbing over the compound wall. And then I don't know exactly what happened, but probably everyone seeing this was trying to run to safety, get into the wards or close the doors. And these wild men, I'm told, they went and with choppers and axes and were breaking down all the doors around, especially in the convent. They smashed everything in sight, and they actually attacked people in their beds. Any adult person, they just stabbed or shot, and there were screams and cries, and I don't know, I remember being pushed into a room, and some frightened nurses were there. Probably my father took me there when he ran searching for my mother. My mother, I believe, was somewhere near the convent, helping an old nun who couldn't walk come down the steps. I don't know what she was doing there, but probably trying to get her to safety. And that's when my father found her. But I was in this ward with a cupboard pushed. These nurses had pushed a cupboard, I remember that. And people were thudding and banging, and they were trying to push this door open. I was in that room.
You weren't in the cupboard, but the cupboard was pushed against the door?
No, the cupboard was pushed. It was a big cupboard, and they had pushed it against the door to protect themselves. These fellows tried the room, but they rushed away. The voices went away, and they went to the next ward. And what they were doing, I don't know. But we could hear the cries and shouts and the hammering and screaming all around us. And these nurses were there with me, comforting me, and they were scared themselves. But we were in that room, And in the meantime, now all this is told to me, these wild Afghan tribesmen had got to the convent. They got all the nuns out. I believe there were nuns of 7 nationalities over there. And they got them all lined up. And my father was there trying to tell these men to get away from them, that these women are holy women and they've been looking after all the people in this area, giving their lives for them, and they're not going to harm anyone. So he was trying to get them away from the nuns and my mother when they got infuriated at the sight of him. He was a very calm, tall and imposing sort of person, and he was like upsetting them. They didn't want him there. So they told him, get out of here, go towards that tree. There was a tree standing over there in the corner. It was a tall fir tree, I believe. And this was told to me by my mother. And he walked, knowing that I think that they're going to kill him. He walked towards this tree. And he opened out his arms. And they shot him dead. As he was walking towards there, he said, have mercy, leave me. I have a child. I have my wife over here. But they had no mercy. And the nuns were also pleading for his life. But they shot him. And as he fell, my mother ran up to him. And she knew that he's going to die. So she asked him to say some prayers. I don't think he died immediately. I think he was taken to this hospital ward. In the meantime, another young Spanish nun had been shot because she threw herself across the body of the Reverend Mother. And she was shot, and the Reverend Mother was also shot. They were critically wounded because there were no medicines or any way to help them. And they lay dying for hours in agony. They were literally bleeding to death. So after this, all these people were probably herded into one ward. And all the remaining people in the hospital, everything was looted, all the medicines, everything. There was nothing left. These were wild men like dacoits and plunderers. They were not of any army as such. In the meantime, as they had just shot my father, the captain, he was probably in the Indian Army. I don't know what army, but he came along and he had been educated in a...
Is this Colonel Dykes?
No.
Oh, sorry.
No, this is a Pakistani.
Captain. Yeah.
Probably a Pathan or something.
You mean the captain among the
Yes. Attackers? They were probably trying to get together, since it was the partition time. They were trying to get together a sort of army for the Pakistanis. I'm not quite sure about that. But this captain was probably a Pathan. And he had been educated in a convent school. And he remembered the nuns as being very kind to him. And he knew this was not the right place to be plundering and killing. So he stopped his men from further. They were just about to kill my mother. She was the next in line. So he came along and he saved the other nuns. 2 had been shot. He saved the others from being killed, and my mother too. And he told her that he'd been educated in a convent school. So that's what saved us, actually, at that moment. Otherwise, my mother would have been killed too. Yes.
So, Angela, if you could just retell the story of that captain briefly.
Yes. Just after my father was shot by these wild tribesmen and he fell to the ground, an army captain came rushing along, and he told his men to stop whatever they were doing. They were just about to shoot my mother and some of the other nuns were still lined up over there. He was probably a Pathan in the Indian Army. I'm not quite sure about what army he belonged to, but he was a captain. And he told his men that this is not a place to be killing people, that these are good people. And then he told my mother and the nuns around that he had been educated in a convent school, and he always remembered the kindness of the nuns and the priests and all the other Christian people around him. So he stopped the shooting and the killing of the nuns, and that's how my mother was saved, and the remaining nuns and nurses of that convent, and probably all the others too. So that's how the killing was prevented, further killing was prevented.
Now, his presence there would suggest that they were quite well organised group. Somebody was organising them quite well, these killers.
Yes. What I feel is, and what maybe I have been told before, is that they were quickly trying to get together an army, because the only army that was there was probably the Indian Army and the British Army. So they were probably trying to get together an army because of the political situation and the partition which was going to take place. So I don't have much idea about the political background of that time. Yes.
Do you have any of your own memories of those tribal men? Can you remember?
Yes. For 11 days we were holed up in this hospital ward, and it must have been terrible for the adults. But we, as the children who were around, we managed. And these tribesmen who were also there, because some of them were being treated for cuts and wounds, they were very kind to us. They loved little children. They wouldn't harm us in any way. And they knew that we were starving and we had nothing to eat. And some of them even gave us apples to eat. I don't know where they got them from, but I remember that they were trying to be very friendly with the children. I don't know about the adults, but my mother, she had to stitch up the nose of one fellow whose nose had got torn. And then it was this very same day that my father had been killed, and she said to him, "You shot my husband this morning." So he said, "Yes, we had to do it, because in time of war, everything is fair."
So you're no, that's right. So you're telling me that these same tribesmen, once they were ordered to stop killing,
Yes.
they stopped killing, and your mum started talking to them, and they started acting quite kindly.
Yes, until they left the hospital premises. After that, we don't know what happened. But probably some of them were left around, or they stayed around, because in the town of Baramulla, there was the Raja, the Maharaja of that area, and he had his own little army. And when these tribesmen came in, they were all fleeing into the hills. And those were the shots we could hear in the distance. And the screams and cries were not only of the hospital. They were shooting people outside too. And probably the Raja was of the was a Hindu Raja.
Just going back to earlier in that day, though, when they were actually coming and looting and killing, do you have any memories of them appearing on the scene, of these murderers? Do you have any of your own memories?
Yes.
Maybe not. Maybe it's too long ago. Maybe you were too young.
The memories I have were of these fellows with beards. This is what I remember, because these sort of nightmares used to come to me later on. I would get up in the night and I would be terrified. And they came over the wall. That I remember, because I was small. And before I was pushed into this ward, horrible fellows were coming over the wall. That's what I remember. You know, with big beards and guns and maybe some with turbans and things like that. But they were all shouting and they were very unruly. They were not like anybody from an organized army. That's what they appeared to be. That is now my sort of memory. Yeah.
So there was a killing spree that day,
Yes.
obviously.
They were looting, killing, and taking everything for themselves from someone whom they killed. They would take their wristwatches. They were real thieves and murderers. And they were not decent human beings. So I don't know how this captain quietened them down and what control he had over them. Probably some agreement they had.
So your mum witnessed your father's killing?
Yes. My mother was there, and that's how she was able to tell me how he walked up very calmly, although everyone was shouting. He had pleaded a little with them. When they would not listen, he did walk towards the tree, very calmly, very quietly, and he stood there because he knew the end was going to come, and he spread his hands out, and they shot him and he died. So,
Can you remember finding out that this had happened, that you'd lost your father?
I don't know when exactly I came together with my mother, and when we came out of that other ward in which we were hiding behind the cupboard, which was pushed up against the door. But I know that we did come together, and it seemed like towards evening. And we were in this ward, and I came to my mother, and she was trying to tell me what happened. And from my memories, they were like the dying and dead, all also lying on the ground over there with the other people. This was one ward which probably held about, at the most, 10 to 20 people. There were 90 people herded into that ward. Nuns, nurses, and patients. And I remember that everyone was praying. Some were sobbing. The nuns were probably trying to comfort us and keep us quiet and try to get us to pray for those who were still alive and not yet dead. Two of their nuns, beautiful Spanish nun. I still remember her beautiful face. And the Reverend Mother. She was an older lady. This nun must have been about in her late 20s, and she was exceedingly beautiful to look at. And although she was suffering and there was no painkiller, nothing to give them, she was just suffering and bleeding to death. And I had not known what death was, but my mother told me about my father, that he had died. And I remember her telling me that she knelt near him and told him to say his act of contrition. We are Catholics, so that was one of the prayers taught to us, to ask Jesus for forgiveness of our sins. And I remember her telling me that. And then towards night, I think this young nun, she was dying. And before she came out to India as a missionary, she wanted, it was her earnest wished to die a martyr. And so her last words were that she was dying as a victim for the people of Kashmir. And then she died. That's what I heard from my mummy. And I always loved this nun and still have a picture of her.
What was her name?
Mother Teresa Lina. Yeah, and so...
So among the other people that died that day were the Colonel and Mrs. Dykes. And we've talked a little bit about their sons. And in fact, we've already interviewed on this program, we've interviewed the children of the Dykes, now probably about your age. And one of them says that a girl came up to him and told him, "Your mother and father are dead."
Well, it's quite probably that it was me, because most probably the other little children may not have known English that well and wouldn't have been able to tell these boys anything about their parents. But I vividly remember my mother telling me that Colonel Dykes and his wife had been killed, and that these wild men had butchered them and thrown them into a well. That's all I remember. But it most probably was me speaking to Tom and Douglas. And I remember in my memories that name Douglas comes back to me. Yeah.
One of the sons says, I think it was the daughter of the lady doctor.
Probably he has, he might have been a little older than I am. I was just 4. So that's how he remembers who I was. So I think it was most probably me speaking to them. Yeah.
You don't remember, of course.
I don't really remember. But I do remember having many friends there before this occasion, this tragic occasion. So probably I was playing with these little children, and especially as they spoke English and we too spoke English at home. So probably we related to each other, were able to play together. So they probably knew who I was, and I most likely met them that day.
This is a scene of carnage, rather like something out of a Shakespeare tragedy, almost. Can you remember, I mean, did it stay like that for days? Did people, I mean, obviously your mum and the doctors were doing what they could, but what happened to the dead people?
From what I was told, all the dead people, they dug one grave. Well, I don't know if it was just one grave, but I know that my father was buried in one grave with many other people. And my mother felt a lot about this later on, that she could not have put him into a separate grave. But there was nothing that could be done about it. So I remember years later, when we were in India, she worked in the missions after that, in the Catholic missions in Andhra Pradesh. And she sent money to this convent of Baramulla, St. Joseph's Convent, to put up a large crucifix over the altar in the chapel. And that was in tribute of all those who died that day, and especially of my father. So that crucifix is still there in the chapel, but we were not able to have a separate grave, and my people have been there, and many of them have seen this grave. Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about this. You were holed up in the hospital for 11 days. Why?
Well, it was actually because we couldn't get away from that place. There was no way we could leave. I don't know what the danger was, but
The killing had stopped.
the actual killing in the hospital had stopped. I don't know about the killing all around of all the other people in the town of Baramulla, because I do know that Reverend Father Shanks, later on we heard that he was protecting people. He protected, I think it was a Sikh person and some other Hindus. He hid them in the priest's home. But the priest's home was burnt down in a few days. So I don't know exactly what was happening, but we were protected. We were sheltered. We were in the hospital ward, and all those who were in the hospital were given protection. But I don't know what happened around in the town.
How many were you for those 11 days? Tell me again.
They tell me that there were 90 people holed up in this ward.
And you remember not having very much choice of things to eat?
Yes, I don't remember anything much. I don't remember suffering much either, because I was small, and I told you they were giving us little snacks and fruit and things like that. But most probably the grown-ups did suffer a lot, but we did manage somehow.
You remember the black bread as well?
Yes, the black bread.
Just say that once.
When I would visit the hospital wards, my mother used to get horrified when these nurses would take out these tins of black bread biscuit, like rusks of bread, and give them to me, and I loved them. I used to munch on them, and she would come in and say, "Don't you dare give my daughter that bread." And that was the bread we were subsisting on. That's what she told me afterwards, that was our only food. And that was what got us through, because there were tins and tins of this which they used to give the little Kashmiri children. So I remember that.
It sounds as if your mum was an incredibly brave woman.
She was. She was wonderfully brave. In the years following, she did suffer, but she gave her life for the missions. She was wonderfully brave that day, I know. That she was able to certify, she was the only doctor there, certify all the deaths and the deaths of her own husband. And she was very calm, and I do remember something, that she could not cry. And it was years later. She never cried for anything. She had become sort of, I don't know what to say or what to call it, but she couldn't give in to her emotions. Her emotions were always like very well under control.
Did that ever change?
It did change years later when her own mother died, and that was the first time I'd seen my mother break down and cry. And that must have given her tremendous relief, and all those years of pent up, she kept it. She kept everything under control.
After the 11 days in which you were stuck, not able to leave the hospital, what happened next? Did you stay in Baramulla, you and your mum?
Yes, I'll tell you about that, because something comes to my mind now, that night or the next morning, my mother told me, "Angela, you stay here. I have to go back to the cottage." And I couldn't quite understand, but she said, "I saw Daddy. I saw Daddy's face. And he was telling me, go back and get the papers." So she had no money at all, but there were some papers probably which would enable us to get some money, or to get some money to live on. So she was an incredibly brave person. She didn't know what was going on around there in the compound. But I think she took someone with her, probably some sort of peon or helper. And she went back and she got those papers, which later on we were able to get some money from that. That's some sort of memory that I have and what she told me. And I remember her telling me on the way back that she saw everything was destroyed. The convent, the chapel, everything was totally destroyed. No one could understand what was wrong with these fellows. What were they doing? Why were they bringing such destruction to such a place where sick people came for refuge? They had smashed everything in the chapel, all the statues of Jesus and all the statues around, except there was a little statue of the baby Jesus. They left that intact. So that's what she told me later on when she came back. So
your mum managed to get the papers, and did you, after leaving the hospital, did you stay in Baramulla or did you leave?
Well, as I was telling you, these planes were going overhead. We were terrified, especially the adults were terrified every time the planes came over. We didn't know what planes those were. But I remember my mother getting someone and the nuns to climb up the hospital roof and paint a huge red cross over there. And I remember that the priests themselves and some of the men around were digging trenches all around because they said they were going to bomb. I don't know what exactly was going on, but there were planes going overhead. Whether they actually bombed Baramulla, I have no idea. I can't remember about that. But all this was going on during these 11 days. And then we were told that a Pakistani convoy was leaving for Srinagar. And we were told that we would be put into these trucks, and we would have to keep very still, very quiet. I remember probably my mother went on telling me not to make a sound when we were stopped at the borders or as we went from one town to the other. We would be stopped, so we had to keep quiet, and we were told that we had to pretend to be dead bodies. And I remember them stopping. It was the middle of the night, and they were going to come around checking. And probably in Urdu, they told them that these are dead bodies. And they let us through because we got through, and we reached Srinagar. And in Srinagar, my sister was in the presentation convent over there. We picked her up, and then we were handed over to the Indian authorities. The Indian Army probably, or Air Force, and we were transported to Delhi in an Army or Air Force plane. I remember that, and I remember in Srinagar we had no clothes, and we had nothing with us. So we were given somebody else's old things. We were real refugees. We were left with nothing. And then we were taken to Delhi, and from Delhi my mother probably told them that we had my father's relatives in Nagpur. So we were taken to Nagpur, and we stayed with them for some time. That's how we got away.
So you had to pretend to be dead?
Yes, that I remember. I remember her telling me to keep absolutely still. And probably the Pakistani authorities were telling us that we would have to be very still, otherwise we wouldn't be able to get through. So they probably would have shot us. So most probably these people were all over the place. I don't know what army you would call them, but there was a lot of conflict and a lot of danger.
So that was goodbye to Baramulla?
Yes.
Now you've never been back. Did your mother ever go back?
No, my mother didn't go back, but we went back to Karachi. She was offered a job there. She came down south. She left me with my grandmother in Bangalore, And she took a job immediately with the same nuns and served them in Trichy. They had a hospital in Tiruchirappalli, it's called now. It was Trichinopoli in those days.
That's in the far south.
Yes. So she worked there with the nuns, and then these were the FMM, Franciscan Missionaries of Mary. And she probably felt that she would like to serve them because she had decided to give her life now to the missions. She had been a doctor in the army, but now she wanted to give her life totally to the missions, not even to pursue the higher studies that she wanted to do. And she worked with these nuns for some time when she was offered this job opportunity to go back to Karachi and to work on the then Mitchell's farms, which was somewhere near Karachi, I understand. Mitchell's is now known as, I think, Kisan in India. They're the manufacturers of all the jams and jellies and things like that. So we were going to be on their fruit farms near Karachi.
This was in the 50s by now?
It was probably just after that. I feel it was 1949. She went back very soon after that because the nuns had told her they're opening a hospital near these Mitchell farms.
So you did go?
Yes, we went. We went back.
Do you think your mum felt uneasy about going to what was by now Pakistan after what had happened in the Kashmir Valley?
Well, I don't really know what she felt, but I know that for some reason she wanted to go back up there. And that's why she took this job.
She actively wanted?
Yes, she wanted, and she took me too. She could have very well served down south. She wanted to go back there. I don't know what it was in her. But that didn't last long. We stayed there a year. She wasn't very happy. There was no proper hospital. She couldn't really do the work she wanted. And we came back. And when we came back, we had another bad experience. There was a lot of chaos in India and Pakistan at that time. People were still moving. The Hindus were coming back to India, and people were going back from India to Pakistan. And we had just bought all the things that we had lost. She had replenished everything, and we were coming back with these suitcases. And we were herded into this crowded second-class compartment. And in the night, we made friends with these people who were coming back with us, probably people who had lost all their stuff themselves. And in the night, she trusted them completely, and we had fallen asleep. When they got down at some remote place, they took all our luggage with them. So we once again lost everything. But I think she was quite used to all that by then, and so...
How often, other than when the BBC rings you up, how often do you think back to those days at Baramulla, those few months?
Well, quite often I think, whenever I think of my parents, it's always Baramulla that comes to my mind. And if ever at any other time I got slightly irritated with my mother over anything, I would think, oh no, she's been so tremendously courageous and brave and lived her life in spite of everything that happened and given us the best that she could. My younger sister Anne, who she had to look after, and myself. And she gave us a wonderful education. She sent us both to England to study. And we were there, and my sister's still in England. I came back as a teenager. But she did the best that any mother could.
And when you think back to Baramulla, what are your memories of it? I mean, you've told me a lot of things already, but I mean, do you feel back with sadness or with happiness, or a kind of mixture?
Well, I think that the blood of the people that was spilt that day was not spilt in vain, because the blood of martyrs will not be spilt in vain. And something good will come out of it, and someday there will be a solution to the Kashmir problem.
Angela, thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for trying to preserve these stories. I was actually thinking, oh my goodness, I really don't want to carry on with this too much anymore. Yes, my mother and father, they were brave people, and I'm proud to have them as my parents. And all the people who were there then, the Dykes family, when I hear of their story and that those children have been found, and those two little boys finding their brother.
Oh yeah, you mean their baby brother?
Their baby brother.
Oh yeah, well what happened? Can you tell me that?
Well, I wouldn't have known about this until I read an account, can I mention, written by Mr. Andrew Whitehead. I was astounded that he had got in touch with them again. And I said, what I have been through is nothing compared to what those little children in a strange country, losing both their parents, seeing those dead bodies, not knowing where their parents are. And I feel terrible to think that I had to tell them, if it was me, that the parents were dead. I think that reading about them in that account, see, they've lived their lives in the most normal way, and I'm sure it's because of the terrible suffering their parents went through that day. Their brave mother who has just had a baby. And their father who must have had such a terrible shock to come back to this, coming to see his newly born child. To see all those terrible men plundering and ravaging, and I don't know who died first, his wife probably, seeing his wife die. And then the children had to live with those terrible memories. And they've lived such wonderful, normal lives. I was astounded to hear, and very happy to know that they're well and happy and normal, happy people living in this world.
Well, I'm sure that Andy has asked them all this, of course, but as far as you know, did they rescue their little newborn brother?
Yes. From this account which I read, their little brother was found on a heap of dead bodies. And they rescued the brother, and they were put in the charge of a missionary lady. That's what I read. And they were taken away to safety. And the little baby was too small to travel, so the older boys went on to England, where they stayed with an aunt. And the baby followed later with the missionary lady. Yes, that's what I read in the account. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Okay. For technical purposes, this is just the acoustic of Angela's room, just for about a minute.